This is Polyamory Weekly, tales from the front of responsible non-monogamy from a pansexual, kink-friendly point of view. A warning for our under-18 listeners. This is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things, like communication and honesty in relationships. If you're under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit scarletteen.com.
This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 568 for March 3rd, 2019. Coming up on today's show, a framework for consent. That's coming up on today's show. Hello everyone, I'm your host Minx, and joining me for the host chat portion of the show is lustyguy.
Happy and lucky to be here as always. Hello everybody.
And I'm always very happy for you to be here.
Yay!
And the kitty is taking a bath in the distance as well.
So you might hear that at some point.
Yeah.
And she's kind of in an
so
obnoxious
if you hear
mood.
licking, that's not me. It's not lustyguy. It's probably the cat.
Yeah. Same
Probably.
with the yowling and the mewling and things falling over.
Yeah, 50-50 chance there. Yeah. That it's me. May I be the last to wish you a happy Metamour Day. I say last because it was February 28th.
A few days ago.
Yeah, just a few days ago. But, I mean, my National Metamour Day was pretty much, I got home from work around 8 like I normally do. And so I asked Elle just to feed the cat, and that was the nicest thing she could do for me. But we did go out for pedicures yesterday as a belated Metamour Day.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, we did.
I missed that.
Yeah.
Where was I?
I don't know. Napping?
Probably. Snoring.
Before we get to Polly in the news, we are doing a show next month.
We are. April.
Yeah, in April we're going to be in Tulsa, Oklahoma for the It's Complicated. Is that what it's called? It's complicated.
That's
okay,
right.
Polly.
I'm glad you remembered because I forgot.
Polly. Well, Polly is a little complicated.
A little bit.
It's a fun way, though.
Mm-hmm. It's the first weekend of April on a Saturday, one-day event.
But we're pretty excited to go. We're teaching a couple classes.
We are. It's going to be busy.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy day for us, I think. But always exciting. One of the things about waiting 2 weeks between episodes is we're getting some really nice, juicy news articles. Or maybe we just happen to hit a particularly favorable news cycle.
Boy, this one really is a very favorable cycle. Great stories.
It really is. And the first article that I saw that came up was from February 19th, and it has the very misleading title of There's a Dark Side of Polyamory That Nobody Talks About. Dun, dun, dun. But really what it is an interview with Amy Guerin of solopoly.net and of The Relationship Escalator, and Dedeker Winston, who is the author of The Smart Girl's Guide to Polyamory and co-host of the Multiamory podcast. And they talk about things like solo poly and relationship hierarchies and why those are not necessarily the most healthy. And they talk about their own experiences with the ethics of polyamory.
I think both of them do a fantastic job representing themselves and polyamory in this article, which is generally a pretty good article. I will say the headline and a theme in the article about how dangerous it is to be polyamory and how people might, say things to you at work or you might face custody issues. I always have a little bit of a hard time with this thought. And it comes down to this. We don't have a poly Matthew Shepard. There is no poly Emmett Tills. In the context of political persecution in this country, the risks that poly people face, custody battles and things, while they may be very real, do not measure up to being met on the bridge with the cops and the dogs and the water cannons. And so when I see things like, the dark, dangerous side of polyamory, or it goes on then later on to talk about how, what are the dangers of coming out and things, I always feel a little uncomfortable, like we're grabbing a straw that probably ought not to grab and might be a little disrespectful.
Yeah, but that makes sense. It's not like poly people are in general. I certainly hadn't heard any cases of poly people being, shot or beaten to death in the streets. And as you say, that, it is very real that people can lose their children and people can be fired from jobs. Little bit different level, though.
Absolutely. It can happen, but there have not been, hundreds of years of night riders coming to poly people's houses and dragging them out into the streets. And I only say that because I think it's really important, especially because there's so many of us white folk in poly, for us to be respectful of the people that come before us and to realize there's not even a stone wall for us.
True.
In the history of oppression and dangerous identities in the States, I'm sorry, poly don't quite rank. I also want to be really careful because I understand that there are people who have experienced very negative examples of discrimination because of their polyamory.
Yeah, like losing their kids or jobs.
In a custody battle, say.
Exactly.
Those things are real too, and those things hurt too. But, again, in the scale and context of oppressive minorities and identity in the U.S., there's a difference.
All in all, though, a very good article.
Very good. And that's me focusing on my criticism because I'm a critical, grumpy kind of get off my lawn guy. Really, most of the ideas in the article are very good.
They really, really
and
are.
I really loved everything that both Dedeker and I'm spacing on her name now.
Amy,
thank you, had to say. They both were fantastic. It's just that idea in the article I have a negative knee-jerk reaction to.
Oh, fair enough. Another article from the 1st of February that I posted to the Polyweekly Facebook wall entitled 7 Polyamory Myths It's Time to Stop Believing, and number 1 is it's not all about the sex. Well, the first myth they busted was polyamory is mostly about having a lot of sex. And while sex is awesome and important, and, polyamory certainly can facilitate more and better sex, that's not what polyamory is just all about.
Well, no more than monogamy is all about the sex, right?
Exactly. That I always want to sort of defensively shoot back when somebody says it's all about the sex. I'm like, oh, right, because your monogamous marriage is all about sex, right? That's the only reason you're doing it.
Exactly.
So you can have legally conscience-free have sex with that guy, right? Yeah. But I don't because I don't want to be that kind of brat.
I do. I just was, in fact.
And they quoted some great people in this article, too. Like, they've really got the right resources. I see Dedeker quoted again, and Liz Powell, whom we're going to have on the show again in a couple of weeks. I mean, I'm so happy that we have so many competent poly spokespeople out there now. 15 years ago when I started, there weren't. You had Janet Hardy and Dossie Easton, and I actually didn't see them quoted a lot. And now we've got this rich resource of poly spokespeople who can speak well and represent the community and the movement as well as themselves.
I was going to make that same point. I remember in the 1990s when I first got involved in the space of sexual political activism, there really was a lack of the articulate speakers that we have now who can represent us very well. And I remember early training programs to try to develop people to do that. And I have to say, I'm really proud of us as a community. And I mean that more than the non-monogamy community. I mean that writ large in the sex positive, sexual enthusiast community that I tend to refer to. I really think we've come great strides. Not perfect. Still I make mistakes. Amazingly better than it was in the 1990s.
And how many of you emailed and messaged and called and contacted me about this? Polyamory on NPR. NP-fucking-R!
Amazing.
It was amazing. And the host did a fantastic job. It was a 35-minute segment. The name of the show is 1A, which I'm not familiar with. And they brought on Janet Hardy and Dr. Elizabeth Sheff and Crystal Farmer and Ron Young from Black and Poly. And the latter two we totally need to bring on the show because they were fantastic.
Homework accepted.
Yes, always creating more work for myself.
That was me.
That's true.
I'm going to be the one that's going to be running them down and getting them booked. Exactly.
That's true. You do the bookings. All I do is sit in front of the mic and look pretty.
Yeah, and do it so well.
But this is a really great segment. We'll provide a link to all of these in the show notes. And the host was very respectful. He asked really good questions. Again, couldn't have chosen better spokespeople. Who they did a really good job of doing sort of the politician thing of not specifically answering, they may not have asked the specific question that was asked, but they provided an answer that was a lot more useful. For example, when he asked Janet Hardy, like, what's the ideal relationship configuration for you? And she laughed and said, what day of the week is it? As a way of showing that, there are all different configurations. It's not about shooting for one thing that looks like this, right? It's about what works for the people involved. And she found a wonderful way to say that without revealing, what she was in. Actually, she did in the end reveal what her current structure was right now. But that came later. She answered the more important question first, which I think he was trying to ask, what should it look like, or what can it look like? And she gave what I think was just the best answer for that. At any rate, it's a really great segment. So excited that we're on NPR and that it was dealt with so well. The host did a really good thing when Crystal, towards the end, revealed that, she's solo poly, by the way, awesome for that representation. And she also revealed that she was on the autism spectrum. And he would always say, thank you for sharing that. I know you didn't have to, or something like that, right? And I thought that was incredibly respectful. But with all of that exciting news, now we're going to jump into an exciting interview with Joseph, the founder and we'll say co-author, co-constructor of the Consent Framework for event organizers. I am super excited and thrilled to welcome to the Polyweekly Studios, Joseph Pred. Welcome.
Thank you, Minx. It's really an honor to be here. I've watched your work for over the years, and getting a chance to share this really important message and tool to the larger community through the power of your podcast is super exciting.
And I want to give a little shout out. We've had to reschedule this a couple of times. I feel like most of the time it was because of me, not you. So thank you for your patience. This does happen.
Hey, life happens.
But for those who may not be that familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
In the default world, I'm an emergency and risk manager. And through that, I ended up working with Burning Man, managing all their public safety for 18 years. And to say the least, Burning Man is full of unusual risks. And one of the things that I was dealing with beyond things like art safety and crowd safety and the kinds of things that are more mundane, I also started the peer counseling Ranger Green Dot program, as well as the mental health crisis intervention team. Both teams played important roles in dealing with boundary violations, with creating safe space, handling sexual assaults, working and cooperating with law enforcement when things escalated to that level. And that gave me a huge base of experience sort of in a community setting, dealing with the intricacies of dealing with consent in a high stimulus environment where there's a lot going on that can sometimes make consent more challenging. I also have a background sort of working in the default world in emergency medicine and dealing with sort of people who are traumatized. And I've been working with a variety of communities, help develop their own processes for how to handle when things go sideways in several communities here on the West Coast where I live. Over time, I realized that there was a need for a tool that could be easily used and shared, because it seems like everybody was trying to reinvent the wheel, and it's really hard.
Yeah, we're definitely talking about consent these days a lot more than we used to. I also want to give you a hat tip and a shout out as the person who gave me a ticket for my first and only trip to Burning Man. And you've also in the past donated some tickets for us to give away as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fun seeing everything that came out of the Burning Man experience for you. The least of which is what I jokingly say, that by the trials and tribulations and the crucible that is going to the playa, oftentimes, relationships are forged there. And so I jokingly take some teeny tiny credit that by donating or gifting you a couple of tickets helped give you and lustyguy the opportunity to really get to know each other.
It's true. We had only been dating for 3 months, if you can believe it, when we went to the burn together, which by some measures was just a really incredibly stupid thing to do. but
look where you are now. So
it's true. I mean, I think it helped that he had been before and he sort of knew what to expect. I kind of didn't, but he's also just fantastic human being. And we communicated really well, including before, during, and after the burn. So it was actually a really great experience. But that being said, you're now working on this consent framework project. Tell us a little bit more about what that project is exactly.
We wanted to create a tool that any community could use, any event, any organization, to make it really easy for them to improve their community practices. And recognizing that there's all these communities that are looking for tools, and with the rise of a much broader audience with Me Too and so many other cultural factors coming together in the last 5 years, I think events have always had this problem. I've been working with supporting events for well over 25 years, and the problems have always been there, but the communities have not always known how to handle it. And, you know, the informal ways in which communities have handled challenges in the past with consent are no longer enough, and people are more willing to be outspoken and to want to follow up and handle issues and hopefully let people grow and learn from their mistakes. And so creating this framework was about creating a tool that helps people not only handle consent issues, but also helps educate people. It helps foster personal growth while creating a safer community.
What exactly is the consent framework?
The consent framework is a free downloadable resource that you can use at any type of event. It could be a conference, it could be a music festival, it could be a community event that helps define your consent practices. The PDF that you download includes all the reasons and it goes into great detail on sort of all the benefits of using it, how to use it. It's essentially 2 or 3 different versions of the same form, depending on each community's need. We've gotten feedback from different communities about how they would want to use it. So we've created different versions that you can choose between. Basically, the core part of it is an agreement that a person would sign upon entering a community or an event or a festival that simply states that they understand the consent framework and that they're agreeing to being a part of it. And that gets into commitment devices that we can talk about later, which is a really strong tool and a part of what we really want to trigger with that.
Okay. And I see, I'm looking at it right now, and we'll provide a link in the show notes. If you're listening along, then you should see the link in front of you if you're looking at the show notes. And what I'm seeing is a definition of consent with a series of bullet points behind it, what consent is and isn't. And accountability, same thing. This is sort of the framework for what we consider to be accountability. And there's a list of bullet points of what it is and isn't and how it would be used. And then there's also a feedback mechanism as well.
Right. We recognize that there's a lot of communities events out there that have really well-defined consent definitions or codes of conduct or already have like a rich culture already established. But we recognize when we brought together a whole bunch of different community stakeholders, there's probably been about 40 different event organizers, community leaders who have come together to provide input. And I mean, we spent 2 years developing this, including working with attorneys to make sure that everything is like really legit, so that, and by providing this as a free resource, we just can make that really easily available to everybody.
So this is something I personally would have to sign in order to get into an event, right?
Right. Some communities have you sign it once when you join their community and it's just kept on file. But the first version is kind of like for the community that doesn't have a clearly defined consent. Like, let's just say, hey, I'm thinking about throwing a house party and I want to be mindful about consent. I've never done this before. You can simply use that form and you don't have to do anything else. But for those communities that already have done a huge amount of proactive work, they can use one of the other versions, which doesn't include the basic definition of consent that we have there. The really important part is the accountability section. And you already touched on part of it, which is that feedback and coaching. My belief is that we've all made mistakes. We've all violated somebody's consent in some small way, or handled something inelegantly that has hurt somebody's feelings. And so really personal growth is a huge part of this. And really the best way to become a better human is to get feedback. And here's one of the mechanisms we really wanted to trigger by telling people up front that by being in this space, by being in this community, you may be receiving feedback or coaching. That makes people more receptive to it because they understand, they're primed for that, right? And then we're also hoping to do that by setting this clear expectation that feedback and coaching is welcome, that maybe people will feel empowered to give it without it having to escalate into something larger. And so by giving more informal feedback when things maybe are not rising to the level of a consent issue, but maybe somebody feels uncomfortable and hopefully they can speak to that by, maybe we only incrementally increase that ability to do that. We think that that's a huge opportunity for learning and growth that everybody can benefit from.
That's fantastic. I think this is really powerful. I love how proactive it is. And it's reminding me of, incidents that happened to me that at the time weren't a big deal and were sort of addressed. But I'm thinking if I and the other people involved had signed something like this, then it would have been much easier than it was. It basically gives you a reason, even a responsibility of saying something instead of brushing it under the rug, saying it wasn't that big of a deal. I think that's really powerful.
Well, here's another part of that goes hand in hand. It's when I've given trainings and talks about the consent framework, I've always asked the crowd, how many people here have had a negative incident happen in some kind of social or community setting, but you didn't say anything because you felt like no one would take it seriously? And invariably, a huge number of hands will go up.
Yeah.
And one of the other things we're hoping to trigger with this and with the feedback we've gotten from people who have signed this, who've used this at conferences, festivals, events, they say that, this makes them feel like, hey, we're all being held to a common standard. And that knowing that the community is taking accountability seriously, hopefully will increase the number of people that feel comfortable reporting an issue. So instead of it having to be what we've seen so often in communities that didn't have clear codes of conduct or clear processes for handling consent violations, is that a person stumbles, we're not even talking about malicious kind of behavior. We're just talking about somebody who maybe just doesn't handle situations particularly well and they're just learning how to use their communication skills. That they end up sort of tripping over themselves 5, 10, 15 times before enough people in the community say, hey, that happened to you too? That happened to you too? Mm-hmm. And so we're hoping that by people speaking up earlier in the process, that person can get the kind of coaching and feedback that can hopefully prevent that from having so many people being negatively affected by it. And we're hoping that when somebody does have a more significant consent violation, they feel safe to report, knowing that there is a commitment on the part of the community to respond appropriately to a consent issue. And here's another thing that's baked into this. And again, we spent years developing this, considering all these different aspects, is that there's quite a few people in communities that are on the autism spectrum. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they have a challenge with is sometimes reading social cues. And talking with people who are mental health experts, they talk about having those codes of conduct are really, really helpful. This is sort of like reinforcing that by having a clearly set of guidelines for what is expected of them. That could really actually help them communicate and participate more easily in the community, understanding, this very sort of straightforward, clear, and unambiguous way of what their expectations are.
You know what else I really like about this is I sat in on and have listened to several panels about consent. And there seems to be a consensus that people really want to see consent violators banned and kicked out, which, kind of, to be honest, kind of makes sense at the time. And there have been people speaking out against that, saying what you said earlier, which is that this only means that they're going to bounce to another community and do the same thing. Problem with the only, the only tool in your toolbox being a hammer is that, of course, as they say, everything looks like a nail. What I really like about this is that, first of all, it assumes the best in everyone. And, forgive me, I've just finished reading Michelle Obama's Becoming, and it really helped me to put a very optimistic face on everything. But I like that it does assume, for the most part, that the intent on people is not to violate consent, and that for most people that there is the possibility of correcting that behavior, assuming that they are not actually a sociopath or a psychopath, which I think is probably the case most of the time.
Correct. One of the biggest challenges we've seen over the years has almost always been when somebody is deeply manipulative, some might say sociopathic, or psychopathic in their affect. I'm not saying they are sociopaths or psychopaths, but just that these are people that have diminished ability to have any sort of remorse or concern for others. And they've been known to take advantage of a community, and then after getting kicked out, they get booted to another community, and another community gets burned out on them, and they just sort of community hop, for lack of a better word. And so by simply removing people from the community who transgress consent, you're not actually providing opportunities for growth. But you also want to, with the people that are these extremes that aren't going to learn, that are not really part of the community, that are doing something more manipulative, there's a commitment device that's being created. And the people that tend to be the serial aggressors in these kind of situations, depending on which set of statistics you believe, anywhere from 1 in 25 to 1 in 200 American citizens are somewhere on that spectrum of personality disorder, of having sociopathic or psychopathic affect. And so while they are the most egregious, when we throw out the baby with the bathwater and we don't give community members in maybe otherwise good standing the opportunity to learn from that and redeem themselves. I'm not saying that should be easy, and there's a number of really great models of restorative justice, accountability pods. More and more events are focusing on how can we do this better that gives people an opportunity to make reparations to the community and hopefully learn in the process.
It sounds like most of what we've been talking about has been for live in-person events, which makes a certain amount of sense because that's where touching and other things will happen. I'm wondering if this has applications for online communities, which also have to deal with a lot of unpleasantness and threats and communications that really defeat the purpose of the community.
Well, this is designed for in-person events, communities, and so forth. And I suppose a community could, part of to engage this tool, you have to sign it. It's an actual agreement. That's where it gets its real teeth, and also is a commitment device. I suppose, now that I think about it, a community that's used it for people to join their community events, that the same could apply online as well. But that would be for people that are not anonymous on the internet, which is obviously a bigger problem.
Well, I'm thinking about Facebook, Apple, every single thing I use has this huge long user agreement that I have to click I agree, that it says all kinds of things like it can use my data for evil and things like that.
Right.
Would it be nice if people could click I agree on something that's, I agree to be held accountable for my actions here? Also,
right.
please, I will give you the accounts of my mother and grandmother. So anything that I write here, you can send to them. That's what I want to see, right?
Right. And that's where the accountability portion, it was really, the intention there was to create something that was short and easy to read and comprehend and internalize. Because if you make it complex, just like we talk about all these, end user licenses that people click on, no one reads them.
Yeah,
this is, in fact, at the bottom, there's like a little section that says, I'm initialing here to indicate that I have read this entire agreement. And this is all part of sort of like making the legal part of it. And the legal part of it says, why, I'm just going to a community event. Why do I need to do all this? The thing that we want to engage is something called a commitment device. And a lot of communities are already using commitment devices, which is like a code of conduct or community expectations. Those are examples of weak commitment devices, because while the community sort of generally agrees to them, you as an individual have not sort of stood up and said, I, promise to uphold these values. So, but there are some types of really strong commitment devices. And one of the strongest commitment devices out there is when you put your signature, pen to paper on something and say, I will do this. It triggers a much more stronger type of commitment, something that you can kind of weasel your way out of, because you're like, well, I kind of raised my hand saying I would do it, but not really. There's all sorts of ways that people try to engage people to say, I will be here to support the community or follow the community guidelines. And they're all good. I'm not trying to say you shouldn't do those things, but you want to have like the strongest possible tool. And so what the accountability section of the framework does is it ties those proactive elements together with the consent framework so that when something happens, you can tie both of those things together to more easily manage those situations.
I think this is a really great idea, and it may not be the be-all end-all, but it's certainly better than, I think, some of the things that we had in place before. So our time is almost up. Can you tell me what's next for you or for Consent Framework?
Well, sort of like a closing point, what I've seen happening with a lot of events now is they've been sort of building these sort of aggregated resources of different types of best practices and coming together and building like toolkits that are much more robust than this. The consent framework is designed to be sort of a single tool in the toolbox. It's not everything. And most recently, Bonobo Tribe, which is a large Bay Area community, has rolled out their brand new consent practices, which is a document that their organization worked on for a really long time. And it includes now the accountability portion. And so what I'm seeing now is through this aggregation is that some best practices are going to roll together from all these different resources. And what I'm really excited about is seeing more and more communities creating these resources and sharing them. And I'm really excited that we're a part of that and will continue to be a part of that and continue to support events that contact us and say, how can we implement this? How can we handle certain types of things? Part of our commitment to the framework is to be there and support communities that are just starting off or communities that are really established to integrate it into what they already have. I hope to attend several more events this year that are integrating it and doing talks to spread the word. And I think, having us here today talking about it and getting the word out through your podcast is I look forward to seeing all the follow-up that'll come out of that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being here. And if people want to find out more about you, Joseph, or about Consent Framework, where can they do that?
The consentframework.org right now points to our Facebook page because being that we're a tiny community project, we have not yet had the budget yet to build our own website, but that is hopefully in the works. We also have a direct download link. It's a Google shortened link. So I think the easiest way would be for folks to check out the show notes for that.
Yep, we'll put the link in the show notes.
We encourage anybody who's got any questions and more importantly, suggestions or experiences they've had with the framework to contact so we can continue improving it.
And that will be at consentframework@gmail.com, or it looks like you also have a Twitter account, consentframewrk.
That's right.
Joseph, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again for sending lustyguy and me to Burning Man. And thanks so much for doing this work. It's very much needed in the community.
Well, thank you, Minx. I so appreciate getting the opportunity to be here today and chat with you.
And thanks again to Joseph for taking the time to meet with us. Really happy that this is a project that's happening, that people are starting to adopt, and I can't wait until it evolves and changes over time. I think it's only going to get better and better. Well, I think that about wraps it up for today's show. I want to thank Joseph again for taking the time to meet with us. I want to thank lustyguy for taking time out for co-hosting when he could be taking a nap. And I want to thank you and all the Polyweekly Playmates for your feedback and for your donations. We are a free resource. We've helped hundreds of thousands of people navigate their introduction to and continued success with polyamory. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, polyweekly@gmail.com or call 802-505-POLY. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/polyweekly. You can find us online at polyweekly.com, where we have a searchable archive of every single episode that we've ever done. So if you want to know, I wonder what Minx and lustyguy think about a topic, just plug that keyword into the blog search and you'll find the episodes that we've done on that topic. We're also on Twitter at Polyweekly and at Cunning Minx and elsewhere on the internet. Thanks so much for joining us today. And remember,
it's not all about the sex.